Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar tonight, where we're going to be discussing how to prep for your virtual medical school interviews. I'm Sarah Godfrey. I'm a third-year internal medicine resident at Columbia, and I'm here with Arthi. You'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Arthi. I'm a second-year otolaryngology resident at Thomas Jefferson, and I'm excited to be with you guys today.
So a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight, just while everybody's kind of filtering in. We're going to talk about this very unique year and how COVID-19 has affected the interview process, particularly in the virtual format, and how to really best set yourself up for that virtual interview. We're going to go over the most common questions you might want to prepare for, and what to do if something happens that you aren't expecting in your virtual interview. And then also just how to decide whether or not you want to go to a school based on a virtual interview, because it might be a little bit more difficult or a little different than it would be in a usual year. And at the end, we're going to try to answer as many of your questions as we can. So why don't we get started?
So who are we at MST? We're a group of super enthusiastic, fun med students and residents who engage in one-on-one online tutoring, both pre-med through residency and through the board. So that's step 1, step 2, and then also this consulting stuff with people who have been part of admissions committees, residents, attendings, who have gone through all these exams, but also have participated in some of that admission stuff, who can help you through your process of getting into medical school.
Great. So let's get right to it, and how COVID-19 has affected virtual interviews. So things to just know based on fellowship cycle, residency cycle, and medical school admissions across the board, everyone's seeing an increased number of applicants this year, about 30 to 40% more applications per school. So some schools are interviewing more people than they would usually. So your odds then, based upon getting an interview, are a little bit lower than they might have been in the past about getting into a school. So we are recommending to a lot of people that you may want to interview at more programs than you normally would. But just so we don't cause any stress for you guys, a lot of people have not heard from any medical schools yet. A lot of things have been delayed this year. So just a good way to keep track is there are online spreadsheets on Reddit or Student Doctor Network where you can get a sense about whether schools are sending out interview applications, interview invites or not. What do you think, Arthi? Anything that I'm forgetting?
No, I agree with what you said. I just want to highlight that what you mentioned about the fact that some schools are interviewing more people, but the number of spots is still the same. So we want to make sure we are cautious about that when we're deciding whether we want to interview at certain programs. So what to expect during this new time, virtual interviews, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for programs? How to navigate this? So first, I'll say that there's usually a social aspect to interviews, and that's usually on interview day. You're meeting some of the people who are part of the medical school, some of the students, you're gonna have lunch with them. Sometimes there's a medical student interviewing you, and how are programs going to compensate for this? Well, we don't know for sure exactly what it's going to be. Some programs have mentioned having some kind of open house system or happy hour where you can meet some of the medical students over Zoom or whatever platform they choose to use, kind of virtually meet some of them to get a feel of the program. Video previews, what does this mean? A lot of medical schools have been making videos about what their program has, what being a student at their school entails, and those are often found on the websites. And if there is some sort of social media account, which I know has been really popular in the residency world, but I don't know that there's as many for medical schools. That's mostly going to be more on their websites. But there might be a video for you to kind of get a gauge of what the program, what the school is like, what the students are interested in, what kind of diversity they have. And then in terms of the actual interviews, there's two different kinds. So there's this synchronous interview, which is more of that traditional interview where you're with someone one-on-one or maybe one-on-two, where you're having a dialogue with them, you're having a conversation, they're asking you questions, you're able to ask them questions. But then there's also this asynchronous format. And what exactly does that mean? That means that there's a pre-recording where there's questions being asked of you and there's not someone live. So that means that you're not having a maybe flowing conversation and there's no back and forth. More so, someone is pre-recorded asking you questions and now your answers are being recorded and people will evaluate them later. This is something you should prepare for because it's not, the same as what you're expecting and what has been done in the past. So just something to keep in mind. And if you have questions about that, we're happy to answer them. And then schools will be different. Some schools will have short interviews where you're interviewing with multiple people and they're each 15 to 20 minutes. I think schools are moving a little bit closer to that during this Zoom era, and less towards that long 1-hour interview where you're sitting with one person for an extended period of time. But that being said, you could expect that at some medical schools as well. And then breakout sessions. So that often is more of a group environment. So you have a few people and maybe a few applicants, and maybe that's what they're doing for their social situation, or maybe that's part of the interview. But that essentially means that there's groups of people getting broken up into separate rooms where there's dialogue about the program or dialogue about you and who you are. And then this concept of more interviews after your interview date, meaning you've had an interview and then you want more information or they want more information about you, and, engaging in more conversation. So be prepared for that it could be something that you experience during this new COVID-19 era. I'm not sure if you have anything to add, Sarah.
I think you gave a great summary. I think the punchline at the end is really that every school is doing it differently. They're all kind of making it up this year, the way that we all are. And so I think there's a lot of flexibility on both ends to try and find the best way for you to get a sense of the school and for them to get a sense of you. So you should be prepared that different schools are going to have very different ways of doing this. So, you really want to put your best foot forward for the program, but you also want to get a sense of which medical school do you actually want to go to. So in this year where you can't actually visit the building and you can't actually see the people that you might want to go to school with, some things to keep in mind is making a list of your main priorities before you go into these interviews. Do you want to be in a certain region of the country? Do you want to do a dual degree? Is there something that's very important to you that a program has? And find ways to very tactfully ask questions that are important to you during the interview day to get a sense of whether this school is a good fit for you. And because you're going to be sitting in the same chair in the same room, a lot of them can blur together as you get through the interview season. So try to keep track with a notebook or a spreadsheet about your impressions of a school after you've met with them. And if there's a specific person or specific group that you would love to talk to somebody from, whether you're interested in orthopedic surgery and you'd love to talk to one of the medical students who's interested in surgery, ask. There's no harm in asking, and often they'll set you up on a date after your interview day to have a conversation who has similar interests to you. Maintaining perspective. It can get exhausting as you get through a lot of different interviews, but really just checking in with yourself about what you liked or didn't like about each one as you go. The last thing Arthi kind of mentioned before is that some schools are getting a little more active on Twitter or some social media accounts to kind of advertise some of the unique features of their programs. So that might be a great way to get a little bit more information. What do you think, Arthi? Anything that I'm missing?
I just wanted to say that, your colleagues from your undergrad who graduated the year before you, they may have been able to go to all these schools in person, and they're great people to reach out to, especially if you know them, or even if you don't know them. People are always willing to talk about their experiences. So it might be a good idea to reach out to someone who's a first year at that medical school or who interviewed at that medical school and might have some input on when they went in person and got a feel for what the school had to offer. there's a lot of people at your disposal, so try to use them, especially in this era where you're not getting that one-on-one experience at the school with the faculty and the students.
I think that's great advice.
Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through evaluating programs and what a virtual interview entails, what kind of questions are you going to be asked at the interview? And the biggest thing that I think we can highlight here is that not much has changed in terms of the questions. A lot of the things that you were asked before, you're going to be asked this time. So, why do you want to go into medicine? What makes you passionate about medicine? What experiences have you had that have led you to a career in medicine? Why do you want to be at this medical school, particularly in this location? And this is a great time to talk about family you have in the area or experiences you've had in the area, or is there a certain community or population that's in this medical school area that you want to serve or you want to have more clinical experiences with? You want to make sure that you're going into it knowing a lot about the school and your questions are targeted and your responses are targeted as well. So know a lot about the school when you're asking these questions and being asked these questions. And then I don't think we can say enough that you'll always be asked to tell us about yourself, and that'll continue forever. If you're interviewing for a job, interviewing for residency, anytime people are going to ask you to tell us about yourself. And while you don't want to sound scripted, and we'll talk about that later, you do want to think about these questions and how you would respond to them and what kinds of questions you might be asked based on what you're saying even. So think about, tell us about yourself, and know your CV front and back really well, because that's what people are going to ask you about, because that's what they have in front of them. They want to know about your volunteering experience at Habitat for Humanity or whatever it might have been that you added to your CV. And then a question that I know on the medical school trail that I got asked a lot was, where do you see yourself in 5 years or even 10 years? And I know I went into medical school not knowing what specialty I wanted to do, and you shouldn't feel that you have to know, but if you have some idea, like maybe you don't want to do surgery and you only want to do medicine, even that's something that you've thought about. You want to show that you've thought about where you see yourself after medical school, and I think that's basically what they're looking for there. And then what's going to change with the COVID era in terms of interview questions? Obviously, COVID-19 has affected all of us. And when you're in school, it affects you because your classes maybe weren't in person, or maybe you weren't able to get those clinical experiences that you wanted to do or you had signed up for. So be prepared to ask questions, to answer questions about COVID in terms of how it affected you, or did it affect anyone around you? They might ask you what you did during this time. Did you do anything to help with the COVID epidemic or pandemic? And so those are things to think about. You know, maybe you didn't directly help, but maybe someone you know helped or was affected by what happened. So to think about these questions before you go into interview day. And then those ethical and situational questions that people talk about will still be there. They might ask something targeted to COVID in terms of how the US responded to COVID, or and what you thought of that, or what you think about mandated masks, because it's relevant and it's something you should think about if you're going into medicine. But be prepared for some of those ethical and situational questions, such as they'll still ask you those same questions, like a challenge you faced, or tell us about a time you were working as a team. So, you know, those types of questions are all available online. You can find them and practice them with people you know. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Sarah.
No, I think you gave a great summary. I think most of these are going to be like a conversation, and then they're just trying to get to know you and get a sense of if you really thought what your future is going to look like. So in terms of the logistics of virtual interviews, so people are using, or schools are using, many different platforms. They should let you know in advance which platform they're going to be using, so you can try to test out using Zoom or Google Teams or whichever platform they're going to use. Unlike me, it is not recommended that you use a virtual background. It can be distracting. Parts of your hands or hair or other parts will disappear. So usually you want to try to have a, pretty blank, non-distracting background that's going to be quiet and allow you to have a good conversation. You want to make sure that you have good internet connection. If you have the opportunity to get a wired connection, that's more reliable than Wi-Fi. If not, just make sure you have a backup device of some kind. You lose power in your apartment, then have your phone ready to call the designated person for a backup plan. In terms of lighting, you want to not just have overhead lighting, but maybe also have some a lamp on your desk or something like that so that you're not in shadow on your face, and try to have quiet space as best you can. Any other tips or tricks?
I'd say one thing that I think I don't think about a lot, but is noticeable to the viewer, the person that you're interviewing with, is to look at the webcam, which is like super awkward because you want to look at the screen or maybe look at yourself so you know that you're not doing anything weird. But if you look at the webcam, it gives the appearance that you're looking at the interviewee or interviewer. So as much as you can, try to do that, and maybe that takes a little practice ahead of time by Zooming with some of your friends or something and just looking at the camera, or doing a mock interview with someone over Zoom and trying to look at the camera. It just gives the illusion that you're looking at the interviewer. So some do's and don'ts for virtual interviews. Like Sarah had just mentioned, check your preview video beforehand. So make sure you look at yourself in that, usually when you get onto one of these platforms, it'll say like, check your video or video preview. Take a look at that. Make sure that you're centered a little well, that your background doesn't look too crazy, that you have the proper lighting, like Sarah mentioned in the previous slide. Just take a look at those things and try them out ahead of time. Also, as Sarah had mentioned previously, try them out and make sure that your video looks okay. Be fully dressed. You never know when they're going to ask you to do something, or for some reason if you have to stand. So make sure you're wearing pants. Your shoes might not end up on the screen, but definitely have pants on. As tempting it is to just leave your pajamas on, try to have some pants that fit with the professional theme. Turn off alerts on your computer. You don't want, and for that matter on your phone too, you don't want things dinging or pop-ups coming up that distract you or distract the interviewer on the big day. Make a list of questions for each program. I don't think that we can say this enough. You want to make sure, especially in this time when there are increased applicants, that you know the programs that you're interviewing at. You know the med schools, you know what they have to offer. You know what kind of population they're going to serve, or what kinds of things that they highlight about their own school. So, you want to show that you're interested, even though you might be interested without trying to show it. And then take notes during the introduction. A lot of people talk about thank yous and making that personal connection. And sometimes that takes writing some things down so that you can remember them for later. That being said, you don't want to seem distracted, so try to minimize that as well. And then some don'ts. Like we mentioned, don't look at your phone, don't look at pop-ups, so try to have all those things turned off. Put your phone on do not disturb so you're not distracted by your mom saying good luck or whatever it might be on interview day. So also, while we mentioned, mock interviews and practicing with people you want to try to not sound scripted. And while you're thinking about all these questions ahead of time, you want it to sound natural, that you're having a conversation, that you are present and thinking of answers on the spot as well, not just reading off a script that you had pre-written. And then again, kind of on the same tone of your phone and stuff, don't multitask. Don't try to take notes on the program while you're answering questions or anything like that. You want to make sure that they feel like you're interested and that you are giving all of your attention to the interview. Anything to add, Sarah?
No, I think that sounds great. I think you want to kind of balance a line between, being interested enough to have notes taken so that you can be specific, but also have your full attention at the person you're speaking with. So it's okay to have, a notebook next to you and glance for a question that you wanted to remember to ask, but try to really hone in on your interviewer. So some common questions. What happens if your cat or roommate or child or anything else comes running through your interview? I just finished fellowship interviews and I had many a child or cat or dog run through my interviews. Most interviewers find that endearing. We're all real people. We're all doing this from our homes this year. The main thing is to just not let it get you rattled. Just move whatever person or creature it is out of the way and keep going. If you know there could be an interruption for some reason, it's fair game to just warn them at the beginning of the interview. Uh, it's entirely possible that my roommate's going to come home during this. I apologize if they walk through the background, and then just keep moving through. What if your computer crashes? It's kind of what we were talking about before with the internet connection. If you lose power, if anything happens, just have the number written down for the coordinator or whoever the designated person that they told you would be in charge of organizing the interview day. They are prepared to shift to a phone interview or a backup plan. So I would have another device and have that number written down for yourself. And then, what if they ask a question that you weren't anticipating? A great way to stall is to say, that's a very interesting question. Let me think about that for a second, and give yourself 10 seconds to just try and come up with an answer. And if you truly can't come up with, a time you failed or a time that a team went wrong or something like that, you can also say, I really can't think of an answer right now. Could we come back to this question later? And then if you think of it later, you can always, kind of circle back to close that loop. Are there any other big questions that you can think of, Arthi, that can come up?
Not at the moment, but I will say that I love the line of, that's not something that I had thought about. Let me think about that for a second. I can't tell you the amount of times I've used that on interviews, because there's always going to be something that you don't anticipate coming on interview day.
I think some interviewers enjoy that. One of the weirdest questions I heard, I think it was during residency interviews, was if you were going to be a kitchen utensil, which one would you be? Which took some thinking. So it's
What was
totally
the answer?
fine. I think I went with spork.
I like that. Versatile.
Versatile.
Okay, so how about red flags? There's going to be things, everyone's not perfect. There are certain things that are going to be on your application that you're worried about, and what should you do about them? So the number one thing that we always recommend at MST is just to be honest and upfront about it. The biggest mistake you can make is to lie about it or try to minimize something that is either lacking or a red flag on your application. Own it. Show that you learned from it. Give an example of something that you did afterwards that was from growth of that original situation. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has something on their application that maybe isn't exactly what they want, but they're just looking for people who have overcome their mistakes and grown from it and can now talk about it in a mature way. Do you have anything to add to that, Sarah?
No, I think honesty is always the right way, and always finding a positive thing that you learned from a difficult situation really shows your character and your strength about overcoming an obstacle.
And I guess just like, if you're there on interview day, you probably have already made it past the fact that there is a red flag. They know it's there. So if they're asking you about it, they just want to know what you got out of it and what you learned from it.
Exactly. So contingencies, some other questions. We mentioned earlier that you should not be stressed if you haven't heard from any schools yet. Things are delayed, but if you get into December and you haven't heard from any programs, or you haven't heard from the programs you're the most interested in, what should you do? So first I'd try and figure out if you know of, or if on the internet anyone has heard from that school. Everyone's kind of on their own timeline, so some schools may be much later than others. But if you do know that invites have gone out, you can send one very polite email to the school expressing in very specifics why that school is a place that you would love to be and all of the reasons that it's a good fit for you. I would keep it short, very specific to the program, and very polite. Um, and you may get an interview out of that. You may also not hear back from a program, but it can be a way to advocate for yourself. The same thing sort of applies if you've gotten fewer interviews than you expected. You can try to reach out to some of the schools that you were really excited about to see if, maybe some interviews may open up or if you could be on a wait list for an interview spot. And then in terms of post-interview contact, it's a little bit tricky. You don't want to pester them or annoy them, but you can send, again, one very polite email to a program telling them how much you enjoyed your interview today, thanking them for the opportunity to interview, and that they are your favorite or one of your favorite schools that you interviewed at and why. Anything else that you would recommend?
I would just say for the post-interview contact, when you were on that interview, if you had some kind of personal connection to someone or you had a good conversation, try to mention it. Jog their memory of the conversation you had, just so, they know that you remember things and you're not just sending a canned message to them.
Definitely.
So what is MST and how can we help you from here? In terms of your admission success. So while you've already submitted your application, we have a lot of experience with tailored guidance. And if one of us don't know all of the answers to your questions, we always have someone who has had experience, and whether that be you didn't get into medical school the first time, and how do you answer those questions when you're on an interview? Or you applied to California schools, and how do you explain you're not from California when you're on that interview? Whatever it might be, we have tailored guidance for you. We can talk more about how to address your red flags and how to, personal statements and CV editing, we're a little bit past that, but you'll be bringing a CV on your interview day if you need someone to look at it before you're there. Over Zoom, things are a little different, but interview prep, we do lots of mock interviews, practice, and how to follow up with schools. If you need help deciding which school to go to after, we have a lot of people here who have been to different medical schools, and we're always here to support you. So let us know if you need any help.
We'd love to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we'd love to answer any and all questions that you might have about virtual interviews, the medical school application process, anything and everything. So you can just put it in the chat.
Mm-hmm. It does look like there is a question here. It says, my interview ended before the end of the time slot. Is that a bad sign?
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a bad sign, especially this year. I think Zoom fatigue is real. And some schools have allotted longer spots than others. And I think if you've had a good conversation, you've asked a lot of good questions, and it naturally seems like that interview has come to an end, that is fine.
Yeah, and I think that there's always, if you've already done this, then like Sarah said, you're good to go, but you can always ask questions. So, every school has a lot to offer, and if you ask them questions about themselves, it also shows that you're interested. So that's a good way to take up a little bit more time. But again, like Sarah said, there's no need to force it after that. It seemed to have wrapped up nicely.
One of my best stalling questions is, if you were at my stage of training, what advice would you have for me? People love to run with that one, and it will get people talking.
I like that. I've never used that, but I should.
Let's see. We have another question here. Will I be asked about COVID during my interviews? It's entirely possible you will. Either from a very practical standpoint of, were you supposed to have a volunteer experience and was it affected by COVID? Or was there a part of your application that changed because of COVID? To kind of broader, more ethical questions about, you know, if you were Dr. Fauci, how would you change our healthcare policy? Sometimes they like to ask big, broad ethical questions about healthcare. So that's entirely possible.
And I kind of think expected. I feel like most schools will probably ask at least one question about COVID and maybe just how it related to you, if not one of these broader questions. I think it's on everyone's mind, and just the fact that you're on Zoom kind of highlights that it's on everyone's mind.
Yes.
There's a question here. It says, how would you address bad grades in an interview? And I think we talked a little bit about just like addressing red flags, specifically bad grades. If there's a course that you did poorly in, if it's one of those core courses like Orgo or Bio, I think that it's always important to talk about the fact that you grew from it and how you did in other courses that was reflection of, you know, learning from that previous experience, or how it changed your MCAT prep, or whatever it might be that shows that you grew from that experience, and that you recognize that it is a red flag on your application.
And like Arthi pointed out before, if you have that red flag and you have the interview, obviously it was not a big enough red flag that they think you're not qualified for their school. They just want to discuss it and see kind of how you grew from that experience and how you then changed course moving forward. Now someone's asking, is it possible to get accepted after getting a little emotional in an interview? Yes, we're real people and they're, can ask a wide range of questions. That being said, it can be a little awkward if you're overly emotional in an interview, especially if it's not expected from the question being asked. So I think, maintaining your calm and your cool as best you can. And if you need a break for a second to just ask to go get a glass of water or something like that, I think that is also fair game to recompose yourself and, start again.
Yeah. This is a funny question for me because on one of my interviews, I actually did not get super emotional, but I think the interviewer could definitely tell that I felt more emotional than the rest of my responses because it had to do with my family and stuff like that. And I think it just shows that you're human. Like you said, to a certain extent, you don't want to be overly emotional, but we all have been through some tough and challenging things. And I think showing that you have a little bit of emotion towards it is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. And then recognizing, some of these questions are tough for the physicians too, and for us too. And just answering them sometimes can cause some kind of emotional response. There is a question in here that says, when asked about controversial things like my opinion on the Affordable Care Act, is it best to take a side or stay in the middle? That's a good question. I'd say that it's okay to show an opinion as long as you are open to other people's opinions as well. You don't want to be too far to one side or too far to the other side, but sometimes just hovering in the middle and not saying anything at all is not the best approach either. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sarah.
I will never, ever forget during my medical school interview that the interviewer, I think he just decided at the beginning that he was going to disagree with everything I said about health policy, about my career, about the future of medicine. Literally anything I said, he disagreed with it. I think he enjoyed that conversation. I think I explained my points of view. He then told me why I was wrong. I then very respectfully stayed with my point of view. And we had a good conversation. At the end, he thanked me for a good conversation. So I think as long as you are not belligerent or you're not rude in any way, it's fine to have a healthy debate with someone. It shows that you've thought, that you've read, that you know something about the Affordable Care Act. So I wouldn't be afraid to have an opinion as long as you're doing it very respectfully. But
I think
during the interview, I thought I was like blowing this whole thing, that I do nothing about anything.
I think you also made a good point that you didn't like waver back and forth. And I think that's something important that we should highlight. You want to stick to your guns in a way. You don't want to just seem like you're agreeing with everything they're saying either, because that sometimes shows that you don't necessarily have your own opinion.
And it looks like someone's asking another question about that. How do you show that you are open to other opinions while sticking to your point of view? I think with things like, well, that's very interesting. But, I read this great article in the New York Times last week that was talking about this, this, and this. And it really, made me think that we should expand the Affordable Care Act to include everyone, whatever it is that the conversation is. Use whatever data or opinions you have. And also, if they point out something that you said was wrong, a fact that you got wrong, just say, thank you for correcting me. I was not aware of that. So just having a healthy back and forth conversation where both of you are willing to move a little bit, but are expressing what you think and believe. And someone saying, yes, include neutral statements like, I honestly hadn't thought of it that way before. It's kind of the equivalent of saying, that's a very interesting question. Let me think about that for a moment.
I was just going to say, you'll, as you go through more interviews, you'll get better at getting through those dicey situations where something awkward has happened.
Yeah.
And we're here to help in those situations as well and how to navigate them.
Okay, so any last minute questions before we wrap up this evening? I'll just wait a couple more seconds.
I
Okay.
guess just to wrap up, I can give a couple final thoughts about interviewing and medical school applications. I'll say that medical school applications are really stressful. Once you get to the residency point of applications, there's a little more security, like you've gotten through medical school, and if you don't get it and you don't match the first time, there's always another specialty or something that you can do. But getting into medical school sometimes feels like that first step. And it's stressful, but if you're committed to the career and you're committed to what you want to do, then you'll get there. There are bumps along the way. And if that means one interview that you didn't want, that you didn't get that you wanted, maybe there's another school waiting for you.
Of course. Good luck to all of you guys. We wish you all the success and that you interview everywhere that you wanted. If you hit any bumps in the road along the way or any big questions, please reach out to us at any of the things at the bottom, the phone number, the website, or email. Arthi and I are here waiting to help you any way we can, along with our other group of brilliant, very enthusiastic tutors. So hope you guys have a wonderful night. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.